Hello, and welcome to the first talk of the 2021 series of the Open UK Future Leaders training sessions. Please note this meeting is being recorded and will be available soon afterwards on our YouTube channel. First, a little about the Open UK Future Leaders Group. Future Leaders Group is a collection of individuals who are interested in open technologies, including open source software, open hardware, and open data. It includes a wide range of people that work in technology, intellectual property, outsourcing, procurement, data, coding, and innovation, as well as private practice lawyers and in-house counsel that work in the technology sector and related fields. It operates under the direction of Open UK's Legal and Policy Committee and has a clear purpose to bring together and develop future leaders in legal and policy matters relating to open technologies and to support and further the mission of the Legal and Policy Committee. Future Leaders Group is currently co-chaired by me, Robert Grinnells, I'm from Phil Fisher, and Katie Gibson, who's from Bristow's, and we're both lawyers advising on technology and commercial matters. The group is always open to new ideas and to new members, whether getting involved in all of our activities or just dipping in and out of our various projects, so please do get in contact if you'd like to get involved. And for today's session, I'm delighted to say that we're joined by Rob Taylor and Rob McQueen. Rob Taylor is Director of Linux System Definition at the Open Invention Network and CEO of Reconfigure.io, and Rob McQueen is Chief Executive Officer at Endless OS Foundation and President of the Gnome Foundation, and they both together were co-founders of Collabora Limited and are Open UK Directors. We'll have a chance for any questions you have for them at the end, so please pop them in the chat box and we'll invite you onto voice and video to ask them yourself if you'd like to. So Rob and Rob, with me, Rob as well, three of us all in go. Welcome to our session today and thanks for joining us. And over to you to talk about founding an open source business.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for the intro. So I want to start today just asking everyone a question. Just take a moment to think about it. What was the last open source business you used? So I'm going to maybe have some surprising answers for this. I mean, you can kind of understand. You probably did use Google. You might have used Facebook or one of the similar ilk this morning, and you know that they are massively built on open source and contribute to a lot of open source projects. Did you use your phone this morning? Obviously, that is built on massive amounts of open source software. The Post. Did you go see your doctor? They're using infrastructure which is all open source. Did you use your heating system? You might have a Nest. They might be running on systems. Have you used your electricity supply this morning? There's open source helping manage your entire electricity system. Have you used anything on the internet? At this point, everything pretty much is an open source business. Now, maybe that's not the answer you're expecting from us about how you build an open source business, but the answer is every business right now is an open source business. So this is really a talk about how you do business well using open source. Now, some of you out there might be thinking, but hang on, my business sells software, right? How can I be an open source business? Well, I've got news for you on that front. Nobody pays for software. Selling software is a revenue stream. It's not really a business model. What people spend money on is getting a job done. So with any business, any successful business, you're asking what is valuable to your customers? What's the thing that you provide them? What's the job you help them get done? Do the clothes get washed? Does the server do you look good? Do you have friends? So for a software business, the ways that you charge for for the value that you give to people are myriad and not necessarily paying for software. Services, subscription, support, warranty, installation, customization, bespoke development, all those bits that the customer needs to succeed. So, oh gosh, I'm sorry, it's just jumped right to the end of the slide deck. That's not great. So we need to talk. So I think, Rob, you're on next.
Yeah.
That's a reason a whole load of slides have just disappeared on me.
I can see the one I was expecting, so I'll go for this one.
Marvelous, great.
So the sort of hypothesis here is that software forms a part of a lot of businesses. particularly here, almost all businesses now having to deal with software either in an operational capacity in providing their products or services, or their actual value proposition is built around something that their customers are doing with software. And software is a complex space. Humanity, we've been at it for 30 or 40 years. We've come up with a lot of ideas, most of them bad, but there are some bits of software that you can get hold of, and they do sometimes work. And most businesses that are doing something with software are not doing something that's completely, absolutely cutting edge, breaking absolutely new grounds. Nothing's ever touched. Humanity have done a lot of thinking and a lot of ideas, and we've written a lot of code. So normally what you're doing is actually building a sort of a tapestry, a patchwork quilt made out of bits of software that exist. So you're leveraging existing infrastructure, existing platform, and then you're putting your own sort of cherry on the cake to make something that's unique and that provides that customer value that Rob was talking about. So, in particularly with our background in consultancy and open source, then we always kind of drew this kind of picture for our customers where there would be a kind of line of commoditization where everything below the line is, in a sense, a kind of shared platform or kind of common platform that exists. And everyone needs something like that, right? If you're writing a web app, you already need an OS with a networking stack, with management tools, with a web server, or all of that good stuff is what gets you up to that point where you can start saying, right, this is now my web service for sharing cat pictures. Well, actually, web service, there's a framework for that, so I'm using a framework. Of pictures, actually, there's a thing for that. So what am I doing? I'm marketing and building a unique experience around sharing the pictures of cats or whatever. So that line moves up all the time. And the reason it moves up all the time is because that drives efficient software development. So, the kind of one thing is almost every business has software in it somewhere. And then the next point is basically open source is just a way of doing that software, doing it efficiently. So, which I think is the next slide, but that's essentially the point. So this is kind of a little bit, the talk title is slightly misleading. I think what we're saying is basically any business can be an open source business. And it's just about doing software well. You can do that by doing open source well. So why can't your business be an open source business? It probably is using open source, probably a part of what you're doing. So the next section of the talk is basically some examples in our kind of collective professional experience of the ways that companies think about software wrongly, ways that companies try and do open source wrongly, and in a sense, kind of cautionary tales. So there's a huge wealth of software out there. There's a huge ecosystem and community of software that you can engage with and take advantage of, and then focus your investment on what you need to be doing. And to really get the best value from that, there are kind of pitfalls and mentalities that you need to avoid. And those are the mistakes that we're going to talk about, or the myths that we're going to try and tackle over the next few slides. So, over to Rob.
Absolutely. So I think the first common myth that hits is, but doing it open source would destroy my business model. Well, I've got news for you. The 90s called and they want their business model back. It's not open source. It's not doing things as open source or using open source that destroys your business model. It's commoditization that destroys your revenue model. So if something is common enough that there's open source for it and multiple people are trying to do it, then if you're trying to sell that bit, you're already onto a losing game, right? And you're probably selling the wrong thing, because that's probably not what your customers are buying. As Microsoft discovered, right? They thought their customers were buying Windows. Actually, they were keeping the businesses running and keeping the businesses working, right? They realized that they're now wholly open source and making much more money and have a much higher stock price than they've had for a very long time. Open source is just the most efficient way to develop and maintain the commodity pieces which you need to build on to provide the value to your customers. On top of this, open source being open source and providing open source in your solution can actually help you create revenue and business models. And we've found this quite a lot over our careers. There may be customers that require the ability to audit and inspect the software that they're running their businesses on, or be able to take, be able to make specific modifications for themselves. A big one is probably privacy and security. So this is, rather than having potentially one big major external player who may be a competitor, potentially being able to see all your business, you might want to keep that private and secure and be running the infrastructure yourself. And that's very similar as well to the problem of vendor neutrality, which is also a massive driver. So I'm using a piece of software. Maybe it's from a small startup, and I really don't know if this startup's going to stay around and be a supplier for me forever. So I need to be able to go and pick another vendor to support me on a software stack. Regulatory oversight is another reason, another thing that can be offered by an open source solution. And the other big driver, I think, is collaboration. Companies realizing that, for part of their stack, they're willing to pay for it, but they want to do something in an industry normalized way, have collaboration. They realize it's a bigger problem than just they want to handle on their own. And I've been seeing that especially starting to happen from anew in the open source hardware space, where we see, very large players like Alibaba and Western Digital and Google coming together and collaboratively building new open source software because they need to de-risk the common platform that they need. Rob.
Yeah, so the next myth that we've come across is this idea that, particularly if you're developing bespoke solutions, you're doing something custom, or you're solving a new problem or approaching a problem in a different way, that the software, you've spent money to do it, I've got my nice team of developers, or I've paid a consultant to do it, that you've then created value, inherent value. And unfortunately, that's not really the case with software. It's more like a sort of rotting banana or an unreliable old car, that once you've bought it, unless you're actually using it and maintaining it, then it will probably not work next time you try and use it. Software that is not being run is also not being tested. Software that's not being tested basically can't be trusted to work. So if you've spent whatever $1 million building some software thing, if you're not using that software thing, the next time you pick it up, then it's really unlikely that it will, start on the first try and deliver exactly what it was that you were expecting. Rob found this great, the guy who wrote this is gone. It's running everywhere. No comments, no documentation. The average standard of software out in the world, I said that humanity had been at this for 30, 40 years. We're not very good at it. It's basically a bit of luck and persistence when software works, particularly if it's very complicated. There are some people who kind of sit at the very cutting edge of building extremely reliable systems, but it is a vanishing minority of the world's software developers or engineers, as they sometimes like to call themselves. So mostly you cobble stuff together and it works well enough for what you're doing. And that's kind of fine. You should be focusing your investment and your development on that very tip of the iceberg, the thing that is providing value for your customers. Everything else is just a kind of pain in the backside, right? You need it all to be there to work, right? Your web app needs a web server to run on, but you're not going to kind of make or break your business by having a different web server or a special solution to those problems. So, there can be millions of lines of code, but the ones that really kind of your value and your uniqueness hinge on will be in the hundreds or thousands. That's in 99% of the cases, right?
Absolutely. So another common myth that we've come across a fair bit is my team's special and they can write all the software that I need and I don't need to build on top of anything else. Now, thankfully, this is happening less and less nowadays as it is increasingly obvious that it's patently not true. But what you do find is companies that are extensively using bits of open source, but not really working with that open source. If you're just using it as a passive consumer, especially if it's an important part of your system, then you're kind of always at risk because you're not participating in helping set the future direction of that piece of infrastructure that is critical to your business. And that is a mistake you see a lot still nowadays. And so we see it all the time with engineering teams where there's literally, maybe the lead engineer is heavily using a piece of software and maybe even hacking on it in their own spare time, but getting no time in the work hours to do the work to be an integral part of that project. If that sounds like someone in your organization and you're in charge, go fix that. If you are using an important piece of software, there's a piece of open source that's important to your business, make sure you have allocated resources to making sure you're a part of that project. Not only do you then get to help set the direction of that project because you become a trusted part of it, it also helps guide you, right? If you engage with experts in the field, they want to help you, right? Because they care about what they're experts in. And this also, this also helps you as well with recruiting and retaining good engineers, having that public-facing view to your business. Rob, I think it's you.
Yep. Next slide. So this is something that we, Rob, Taylor and I have how many decades of experience of coming across people who believe that what they're doing is unique and innovative and groundbreaking and particularly special. And we could spend the rest of the call listing out every sector where we've come across people who have claimed or asserted that. The one that sticks in my mind, I've sat in a number of automotive Linux meetings where I'm like, this IPC is great, but is it specially designed for automotive? And that basically just becomes like a drinking game, like automotive grade playing beeps through a speaker. Like, no, I can't use this existing beeps through a speaker software because it wasn't specially designed for automotive. Or whatever, right? Specially designed display controllers. Oh yeah, that's been solved. Whatever. There's so many of these. The reality is, it sometimes can be hard to hear if you're a product engineer. You're probably not doing something that special almost all the time. Like unless your company is basically a university spin out, stacked from top to bottom with PhDs, breaking new ground in a field. You're probably actually innovating somewhere else. You're probably innovating in, a service offering, in a business offering, in the way that you assemble pieces. Very little innovations that have, shaped and refined, modern society have actually come as an aha, like a kind of eureka moment. The majority of what we use and rely on now comes with the right ideas being put together in the right way, appearing at the right time. So your actual software innovation is probably a marginal part of your overall kind of business offering. And so if you approach your engineering with this idea that you're doing something like absolutely, blue sky, new, never been done before, then you will kind of inherently turn your back on the existing ecosystems that are experts in your problem space, the code that solves problems that are either the same or adjacent to the problems that you're solving. And there's a reason for this, right? It's easier to write code than it is to read code. You start with your nice idea, you start writing it, then reality comes in and your code becomes uglier and worse and harder to understand and harder to maintain. And so all software ends up like that. All of the open source projects you could use are going to take some time to learn and get your head around. But it's this idea of a kind of stitch in time saves nine. So if you actually get your head around the complicated software that exists to solve the problems that you will inevitably face, if you spend your time to get to know the people behind it and to work with them, then those incremental changes that you need to solve your specific problem will always end up being cheaper than your lightweight, simple solution for your special requirements, because that will turn into basically a less resourced version of the same crap that's already out there. There's kind of an inevitability behind software development, and it all stems down to it's easier to write software than to read it. Coding is easier than debugging. Deploying someone else's solution is frustrating for an engineer because actually it's easier to open a nice, all software starts nice until you write any of it, and then it goes downhill from there.
Very true.
Another special shout out here to the lawyers on the call. This also applies as much to licenses as it does to code. If you're reusing other people's code, you're part of communities where you can find experts, you can find people who are familiar. If you run your services on AWS, you can find an AWS engineer to understand that. If you've built your own unique special Snowflake infrastructure, nobody will understand that. Nobody will want to come and work for you. The same applies to licenses. There are so many kind of corporate entities, particularly trying to engage in open source models or look like they're engaging in open source models, who come up with their internal requirements for a new license. I want it to be open source except on Tuesdays. Now I need certain special attribution or whatever. And so for as many kind of needless software projects that there are in the world, there are also needless licenses to go with them. In practice, there are about 4 or 5 licenses that you should seriously consider for any projects that you're contributing to or originating as an open source kind of participant. If you think your requirements are special and require a new license, you're almost certainly mistaken. And the preponderance of all open source in the world and all of the open source businesses in the world is evidence to the contrary. Right? They've managed to muddle by with these licenses. If you go outside of that and you come up with new licenses, you will almost certainly get it wrong. You will create bizarre interactions that prevent people from being able to confidently use your software. You'll have differing interpretations of those licenses, and you're essentially confusing and frustrating people that you're trying to collaborate with. So you're causing another company's lawyers to stop the engineers from using your code or taking part in your ecosystem. So the benefits are very small, and the downsides are large, because in a sense it's kind of tying your laces together before you've started the race. You've created these barriers to people being able to collaborate with you. And the whole purpose underlying an open source kind of engagement is that collaboration. It's the kind of herd maintenance and shared cooperation behind the software that you want to use. So the same reason that you want to reuse existing components and share that, you want to reuse the existing licenses so that you're presenting as little barrier as possible to people engaging in that community process. That's what you're trying to do by adopting open source. Right.
And that leads me really nicely on to the next myth. But we did open source. Throw some code over the wall, and so there's 2 versions of we did open source that you see out there. So there's the find some code inside your organization that you're not making any money from, and then release it as open source. Or there's the we'll have an open source version of our product. We're an open source company. We have an open source version of our product, but of course, that open source version of your product has a contributor license agreement, so so you can relicense it in your own way, or even like doesn't allow any contribution at all. We've seen that so many times. The Android's better now, but certainly in the early days, it was exactly like that. You send some patches upstream, they might rewrite it if they even look at the bug report. And so if you're in that camp, I refer you to slide 1, myth 1. There's something wrong with your revenue model. You're selling the wrong thing. If you're in the kind of like, we've open sourced something, we've got something great we've developed in house, and we're going to open source it, and then we're going to try and drive adoption in the ecosystem. This is something I see really regularly. It's almost certainly not going to work. I mean, there are a few examples where it's been successful, but they are by far and away the edge cases. And so if you're doing a strategy, don't believe you're going to be an edge case. You know, look at what happens with the vast majority of code releases into open source. Most of them fail. And the real reason is because the value of an open source project is the size of the community around it. Purely that. It's almost nothing to do with the code base. So it doesn't matter how good your code base is or how cutting edge your solution is. If you throw something over the wall, you've got a long haul turning that into an actual open source project with people contributing. The few cases where I've seen this work is where like it's a one-person project internally, they take it externally, and then they really work on it, bringing it up into speed. Any large code bases, you're with multiple contributors internally, you're probably onto a loser. So don't do that, right? You know, if you've got something you think's great, you've done it internally. The important thing to remember is when you're solving a hard problem, once you've solved it once, you can recreate the solution, right? The hard work is figuring out what the problem is and how to fix the problem. It's not writing the code. So if you've got something you want to do that, there's no open source project that's quite doing it, go find the community that's close to most aligned with what you're trying to do. Go in and contribute your knowledge and expertise and help them reach that goal. That will be much more successful than taking some code, throwing it over the wall, finding a few junior members of your team and assigning them as the open source project leaders. That's just not going to work. Find and align. I think is the core message there. Rob, I think you're on.
Yeah. This one is essentially a sort of holder for a bunch of what I would call kind of bad behavior. And it's essentially engaging open source, but keeping one hand behind your back and trying to set up some kind of inequality that benefits you and disadvantages other people. One rule for me and one rule for everyone else. When it comes to corporate actors, requiring IP assignments so that you can set up a kind of licensing inequality, IP is assigned to you and other people get it under an open source license. That's a really great way to make sure that no one really cares about participating in your community. I think there's a kind of acceptance more widely that contributor agreements that clarify inbound licensing and the right to license, that they're okay, right? They're saying things that the licenses don't always say. Some licenses do have explicit inbounds licensing kind of terms. So inbound equals outbound is kind of built into the license. And sometimes you need an agreement to put that in place. But then you're not setting up an inequality, right? You're finding you're just setting up a level playing field for people participating in the project. There's a kind of an even worse version of this that's the kind of straw man open source. Like, oh, this is completely an open source project. It's GPL v3 with an additional clause that requires you to stand on one leg and sing Kumbaya. It's absolutely open source. Feel free to join in, use it whenever you want to sing Kumbaya. And if you do contribute, then please assign the copyright to us and we'll build a business model where we sell it under not that license. Because in practice, we don't expect anyone to ever use it under that license. So this kind of straw man open source, again, it completely vacates the purpose of building, with, on and around open source. You're basically telling your community to go away before you've even got one. And that's the same around this kind of, I think Rob mentioned it in the last slide, but this kind of idea of a sort of straw man open core, right? That's, we build our products here and, we build it on great open source baselines. And if you go to our FTP server, you can find a copy from 2 years ago that we've released as GPL. It probably won't work. if you contribute to it, we don't care because our internal version is completely different. Go forth and communitize. And, why is there any incentive for people to spend any time and effort fixing up an intentionally broken version of your product? I think, it's fair to say here that there are ways of building working open core code bases where there is a healthy community around a central piece, and there are, differential value add leaf pieces that lay on top of it. So if you're maintaining an open platform and people are participating in that, and that's the real one that you use, and then you put something else on top of it, and that's your USP and things, then that's okay. I'm not talking about that kind of model. I'm talking about this model of like, yeah, sure, you can use our CRM. We've got an open version and the sales version. Not seeing out any CRM providers in particular. But you use the open one and it's just rubbish. It's barely functional, doesn't work, it's from years ago, and there's no ecosystem around supporting or using it. And the last kind of bad behavior is basically just lying, right? Sort of like, here's a free version, a brilliant, absolutely free to everyone, absolutely happy to use it, go for it, knock yourself out. And then you do use it, and then you get a call from the lawyers. Like, oh, actually, sorry, just kidding. You do need our patent license there. Or you actually are using our trademark. So we need you to actually pay royalties to us if you want to continue offering this as a part of your, product or service. And I've seen this, I've advised customers on how to replace their reliance on projects where they are supposed to be open source. And then there's actually been basically a protection racket, which is where our evil raccoon comes into it. That's a nice cloud you have there. It would be a shame if something happened to it. And all of these are basically just not playing by the rules. They're about kind of trying to set up or leverage some kind of inequality. And if you're going to do that, then you may as well not engage with open source or not have the pretense of open source, because this is just really bad behavior, right? It doesn't tribute out into the commons. You're not leveraging the expertise and the collaboration in those commodity pieces that we talked about. You either do it and engage with that commodity and that community, because then you'll get the commercial benefits of doing that. But this kind of idea of open washing and sort of trying to pretend that you're doing open source stuff when you're not, it's just really frustrating, and it's kind of a waste of everyone's time.
Absolutely. So to sum up our talk, and that's the end of the myths, and we'll have some space at the end for everyone to take questions around those. But really, to sum up, it's quite straightforward. How do you create an open source business? You sell something that people want to buy, something that does a job for them. Don't sell a software license. That's the wrong thinking. Rob?
Yeah, and sort of back to our iceberg model. It's really about making sure that your primary focus and your primary investment with, whether it's marketing, technology, engineering, product, is around what's valuable and unique for your customers, and that your investment is there, and that you're kind of doing that. You are adding something new that your customers can only get from you, and that's where you should be spending all of your money. So it stands to reason that everything else, you want to be as efficient and lean as possible, and you want to be able to leverage the open source and be able to understand and rely on it.
So if you are building something new or creating some new functionality, proactively look for existing open source software that you can reuse. Or if there's nothing quite there, find a community that you can collaborate with. Simple as that. Oh, sorry.
And almost the kind of the flip side of that is working with the experts in the field. So find those communities, and I think the other thing is empowering your engineers to go and do that collaboration and that guidance. So if you find the experts and you find the passionate people, then they can actually help to set your agenda and to do that influencing that gets you the best kind of collaborative engagement with these communities. So it's, find the experts, find the passionate people and trust them. And then you'll be able to find these kind of win-win configurations where your business needs sit very comfortably alongside the interests and the motivations of the open source communities that you work with.
Absolutely. So to sum it up, collaboration earns influence and reputation, and you reap what you sow. When you agree, Rob?
Yep.
You get back what you put in, and that is how you have an open source business.
Thank
you very
you
much.
so much. Yeah, thank you for such an entertaining start to our 2021 series. If we open it up to the floor, and if anyone's got any questions.
Can I ask a question? Yeah.
Course.
So I love what you were just saying about when you start. I'm going to go for it. Yeah. So when I was on a call earlier this week with Deb Bryant from Red Hat, who another great person in open source, and she said exactly what you've just said, which was don't go and create something that already exists if you can reuse it. Start from what's already there. Great advice. And I think there's been a few pieces of great advice. This is slightly unfair, but have you seen Elastic's announcement that they have moved from open source to public source? And would you, maybe you won't want to comment on it because it's very new news, but also that idea, that public source idea where you can share your code, but you're not putting it on an open source license, so you are able to do things that OSI licenses don't allow you to do, like discriminate on a field of use, like say no commercial use, which I assume is where they're going. So I wonder if you guys would comment a little bit on that.
So, sounds like somebody who are Elastic still private, or have they IPO'd?
I think they're still private. I think the IPO
still
was delayed.
So it sounds like someone, some lawyer somewhere is prepping for the IPO, and someone at Ernst Young or similar has said, "Oh well, we can't possibly IPO with this. We need to push the price up. Let's push the price up. Nobody understands this."
Yeah, I think Elastic's story is slightly different.
That's what's going on. I don't know. That would be my assumption. What's going on? And clearly, Elastic, I would say, absolute mistake.
Elastic have had a bit of a controversy over the last couple of years with AWS and other cloud providers. I don't know if the litigation has been set aside, but they were suing Amazon around trademark infringement, and they're part of that whole open core, am I open source, am I not thing that's been going on over the last couple of years. Interesting. Mr. McQueen, any comments?
Well, that's exactly why Google have been looking into actually moving the trademark out into a sort of community sort of vessel, exactly so that those shenanigans can't happen, but then the software can be left as something in the commons. So, I mean, I don't think that these things will be successful. I mean, history has shown us, so, I mean, Sun Oracle acquired MySQL, and then the MySQL team forked it and continued developing it better outside than the version that they acquired. And the customers, there's an inequality here, which is kind of such is life, right? But it's Elasticsearch, if they're trying to use IP licensing to leverage an unfair playing field, they're going to lose because their customers and everyone else in their ecosystem has more resources to throw at solving the problem than they want to at paying these people. So it's basically, I'm saying it's not unique enough to entrench and leverage an inequality. People will roll back to the old version, they'll use a different technology, they'll clone it, it will get forked, there'll be an open version, and it's inevitably going to fail. They haven't solved a unique and valuable enough customer problem to try and entrench their position like that, I don't think. If I'm wrong, sorry to the Elastic folks, then good luck. But I just don't feel that you can sort of go back to that idea of as Rob said, the 90s, right? That's an old model, and empirically it's not a sustainable one in today's kind of technology space.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Just before I disappear off and let the next questioner up, there is a podcast called Open Source Underdogs, and Shay Bannon at Elastic is one of the people interviewed in it. But I particularly like I can't remember his name from Pivotal, and then Shannon Williams at Ranchers podcasts, where they talk about how to be successful in the same environment. And I think they're really informative. But thanks for the answers, guys.
Yeah, GitLab actually have a fascinating blog post about their journey to their business model, of what they were able to actually provide unique value and monetize, even though the 95% of their product is completely open source, and and anyone can run it. So it's true that having open source at the heart of your business kind of forces you to be a little bit more creative, because the obvious thing is not license out the software, right? The things that actually allow you to build models are around addressing customer needs. And WordPress is a great example, right? The software is open source, but the service provided by WordPress is marketplace for themes and plugins, hosted service, managed service, people who help you set up your website, all that kind of thing. So they have a whole ecosystem. It's not that they sell WordPress, it's that they've enabled an entire kind of blog creator and designer ecosystem, and that's what they monetize. So they've solved a far bigger customer need. Actually, the software is not the interesting bit. If you want to run your own blog software, you'll find one, right?
Oh, thank you. So I think we've got a question from Oliver, if you want to ask that. In the chat. You want me to? I can ask it. But basically, it's someone saying that they see all these myths all the time, and how do you convince companies that they are wrong about?
You show them talks like this, or introduce them to an expensive consultant who, once they've handed their money over, then the expensive consultant can tell them these things. But I mean, some of these things you learn by experience, and then depending on your style of assimilating information, you might have to mess these up a few times before you actually come to appreciate them. And it's a learning process. But I think trying to find peers, so similar organizations or similar level managers who might be able to give different perspectives, trying to find experts who can be trusted. Never underestimate the power of a consultant. It's like, I've been telling you this for a year. Oh, I think we should go and ask these guys, what do they think about our open sourcing plans? And if you've paid enough thousands of dollars for it, then it goes through a different door in your brain, and it might bring a message home in a way that's maybe internally or as an external kind of voice you've not been able to get through. I don't know, Rob, do you have any ideas?
No, I mean, we just keep telling the story and telling people what we've learned, and feel free to share this talk with somebody who thinks might need to hear it.
Yeah, and Rob and I, in our careers of decade plus of consultancy experience specifically, so we've been the ones going in and trying to gently or less gently bring our clients around to these perspectives and these, in a sense, kind of facts of life of working in and around open source and efficiently building solutions. And some listen and some don't, but that's the way with consultancy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. So, any more questions?
Could I ask one?
Yes.
Go for it.
This one's really aimed at Mr. Taylor, and he's done something quite special. He's jumped from open source software into open source hardware. And the questions I'd like to ask, two of them really. Do all the myths apply that you showed earlier to hardware? And are there any other myths that apply to hardware and not necessarily to software?
No, I mean, hardware is just a big special case of I'm special at the moment. They're really, I mean, it's all the same. It's just that industry is at the start of learning about collaborative building, right? At the end of the day, yeah, sure, if you're going to make a chip, it's a big investment to make a chip, and you've got distributory costs and that sort of stuff which need to be covered in your business model. But that's true at multiple levels of building a product and selling it. There's no there are plenty of embedded systems that basically just have a bunch of open source software tied together to provide a solution, and you need to make those and ship those, and you have tooling costs. So yeah, and really, and what I'm finding in the hardware space is these guys have been really suffering from being like there's a whole load of kind of like the Stockholm syndrome everyone had with Microsoft, right? or buying IBM, all the worlds before open source, when you really did have to engineer a whole load of stuff yourself and pay lots of money for people to engineer new things for you, which is all the same stuff that everyone's doing, or have your own tool, build your own tooling to solve the common problem that everyone else has to solve. So I think there are, in bringing open source to the hardware space, there are potentially, I think it's going to be absolutely transformative of the space and absolutely transform the rate of innovation in hardware. And it can't come soon enough. You're on mute, John, if you've got any more questions.
Rob and Rob, I've got a question, if I may.
Sure.
Regarding hardware again, because we run an open source hardware and software company here, and can't sort of I really sort of agree with what you're saying in terms of where things are going, where the community is going. Are you seeing a lot more uptake from sort of commercial companies buying open source hardware as well? Because traditionally there's been a lot of talk about software, but what sort of uptake are you seeing in industry with open source hardware now? How does it compare?
It's still it kind of depends on which piece of open source hardware you're talking about. So people building stuff off open source PCB designs and circuit designs. There's a lot of that going on, especially in the IoT space. So I'd say, again, it's a bit like Linux was in the early days when I first started in it. It's like kind of a bit of a dirty secret, you put a box around it and pretend it's your own special source. But I think that's very much the case. That
one thing we've noticed is you can buy development boards. There's lots of open source development boards out there. But one thing I think is lacking is open source products, as in a polished product, that you can buy in a nice case, like you would a commercial closed IP product. Those things are a bit thin on the ground still, but I think times are changing, and we're hoping to make a dent on that as well here.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think you're on the right side of history, and the people that are not doing that are on the wrong side of history. I'd say with chips, we're further away, but it's starting to happen. I know of companies that are going to be shipping hardware with open source chip designs on it. Well, actually, to be honest, again, dirty secret. I worked at a company before I started Collabora that was using open source IP cores in their product. So very similar software. There's actually kind of a long history of it. It's dirty secrets. So when it starts becoming the way that the business leaders see as the way to operate, then you'll get that kick of acceleration that the software world has had since 99, 2000 onwards.
Yeah, the sort of precursor to having collaborative models and open source and sort of shared designs and communities is that commoditization. So I think a great example is the Raspberry Pi platform now has a compute module, and it's by $20, right? It's at that point that it costs you more to think about using another piece of hardware than it would to just put a DIMM socket and just stick one of those in. And so
you mentioned that we use that here as well.
Yeah. So I mean, the field is wide open for an open source one of those to appear and have multiple manufacturers, potentially little bits of innovation and a bit of kind of refinement around those ideas. But that commoditization and people being able to say, to a first approximation, everyone needs the same thing. Now all we need to do is optimize the supply chain. So one of those optimizations is being able to share specifications and write the same thing. Another one of those optimizations is trying to build that in the same way. And ultimately, those designs become shared, and then you've got kind of a very kind of vendor-neutral space. And that's happening on the first full ends, these IoT things, and just putting an Arduino inside, putting a nice box on the outside, and pretending you're something really clever. On the opposite ends, hyperscale cloud providers don't want different firmware and different depth and different cases, whatever, from all of their vendors. And so they've been the ones to actually start saying, we're going to design the data center with an open design, and then we're going to require our manufacturers to step up to that. We're going to, in a sense, force our manufacturers into this commodity kind of process, because that actually makes it easier for them to interchange and maintain infrastructure. So you see those kind of open server designs, you see, open firmware so that the servers all have the same interfaces. That's just good business sense. If you are going to need 1 million servers or whatever, you just don't want to have to think about, is this an HP or a Dell or whatever. It's just not, there's no incentive to do that. So that commoditization and that pressure to get efficiency at those interfaces between modules in your stack, that's what sort of drives the need to collaborate, and then eventually will take you into these open models.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've probably got time for one more question, maybe two. Actually, Pavel's got his hand up.
Yep. Hello, everyone. Thank you for your great feedback, and thank you for your explanation about cases for like open source business. It's not actually questions, it's more just my way to share experience, because I'm open source project leader and have been running for like 6 years, and it's more about ways how you can start open source project, because typically you may start it from different ways, but in many cases you start as from writing code. But I think it's one of the main mistakes when people start from writing code, and then like you have code, you write something, and you wait for people cheering you on Hacker News. It will not happen, unfortunately. Because from my own experience, writing code, yes, of course I can code. I implemented many features for my open source project. But in terms of my time, it's 95% it's community work. It's replying questions, spreading word, participating in different chat rooms, like talking with people, and just
Code
maybe
review.
5%. Exactly. And it's like 4%, maybe 3% is actually writing code. And this kind of mistake I saw it many times. And people with really great software, brilliant implementation, polish it, perfect, performant, they fail it just because of they implement the software and they stop it. It's just only beginning. And one advice from my perspective, I think it's actually hurt me many times, because when people talking about you can start open source and then you can move forward into monetization in some ways, and all the time, and especially in Linux or focused forums, you can expect question like, oh, you can do it exactly as Red Hat. It's one of the worst advices you actually can experience, because to monetize your open source project, it was really great advice from your side, Rob, because you need to be very creative. Don't try to sell software. Don't try to sell support. Because from my perspective, I never ever for more than 6 years experienced ever single request for people guy, we can't pay to you for support. No. And for many projects, it's also because of course, it depends on project, and if you implement your software in special way, you can expect lots of incoming support requests. But one of the main findings from my perspective is you need to be extremely creative. It's actually I like your conversation about hardware, because hardware is one of the ways how you can monetize open source software.
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of different models, and you really got to focus on what. I think my advice to you, Pavel, would be really focus on on what your customers' problems are, what they're solving with your software. Because yes, you can definitely have a business that charges for support, but it's what you're supporting, right? The model where you're supporting a given open source library, that's quite a hard one, right? It's really hard to make money doing that. If you're supporting the business, in solving a key problem that they need to get to market, that's a different conversation altogether. And so, I think a lot of it, you need to be really, and one of the great things, if you do have a popular open source project and you are thinking about how do I monetize this? How do I make some money out of this? Use the participants in your project. Go and spend time with them, understand what the problems are and why they're solving them, right? What's the drivers of why they're solving those problems? And that will help you understand where the real value proposition is, because you want to get closer to the source of the money, right? When you're selling to the engineer or the engineer's first level of management, you're at the bottom of the cash pyramid of an organization. So if you can go to what so this team's providing some value to this team, which provides value to this team, right? So the further you can push up the spec in the value proposition, the more value you can extract, the more monetary value you can extract for solving core problems of the business. So, use your community to understand what are the common problems that people are trying to solve, which unspoken, why are they using your piece of software?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's great advice because typically when you sell commercial software, people are not very open about talking with you. What's their problem? I don't know. For some reasons they don't talk so much, but in terms of open source, people are very open because I think it's just their way to pay back to your time, to your effort. They explain their case, they explain their problems.
Yeah.
It's really great feedback.
Thanks, Pavel. Yeah. Have we got any more questions? Questions, preferably.
Any more?
No?
Well,
we're on the hour.
I'm on the hour. Thank you so much again. That was such a great and entertaining talk, and definitely a good time for a January talk. So next week we've got Cheryl Hung, who's the director Cloud Native Computing Foundation, talking about cloud native and platform issues. And Cheryl was named by We Are Tech Women as a tech star last year. So hopefully lots of you can join us next week at the same time. So thank you again to both of you. And have a good rest of your day.